Right, I think I'm going to start with just a short introduction from my side, Salon. So my name is Dion de Swat. I'm one of the managing partners at Africa People Advisory Group. And I always say I'm the one person in the company that's lucky enough to live in Cape Town, because I do consider it to be a privilege. Not the best of days, it's a little bit overcast. But welcome to the webinar, and I'm going to ask Tina Daishi just to do a quick introduction from her side as well.
Thank you very much, Dion, and good morning, everybody. As Dion mentioned, my name is Tino Daishi Mandiebu. I go by Tino. I'm actually an associate consultant with Africa People Advisory Group. I'm very happy to meet everyone and to discuss a very exciting topic.
Thanks so much, Tino. So we're going to start with a quick poll, and I hope it's going to come up on the right page now. We're very keen to know where our current participants are from. So I see the numbers are picking up. So there's a couple of options here: East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, and then other, just in case we had people from places outside of the continent, or unless you feel that you live in a country that doesn't fit anywhere, please feel free to do so. So we've got about 75% of people that have voted. Really good representation from South Africa. Great representation from East Africa. We've got 15% of people from West Africa. I'll give it a little bit more time, and I'm sure more people will join, and then we can get a sense of where everybody's from. Nobody from Central Africa. Maybe it's a need to have more of this conversation in French, I guess, going forward, and to have the option of that. So let me quickly end the poll and just share the results with you. It should be coming up on your screen. Tino, just give me a thumbs up there to confirm that you can see it. Perfect, right. So I think pretty good representation from across the continent. I think we are likely to have probably a couple of numbers still picking up from West Africa, but a nice representation from where everybody is at. So thank you so much. Right, so let's talk a little bit about the topic for today. What we want to focus on in the conversation today is really human resources competencies for the future. And I'm going to go off camera, and then later on when I hand over to Tino, she will take over. So as I mentioned, what I want to talk about today really is the human resources competencies for the future. We've taken a pretty critical view looking at some of the work that we've done, but also what other large consulting firms have done to come up with a view today around the kind of competencies we think will be important for our discipline into the future. So just by means of an agenda, I'll talk a little bit about the changing role of HR. I think we can all attest to the fact that it's been a bumper ride over the last 2 years, and there's been a lot of non-traditional work thrown at the human capital and human resources function to make sure that we can optimally support where the businesses are moving across the continent. I think it's important in a conversation like this just to back it up with a little bit of research. So we'll share just highlights from 5 studies, one of our own and 4 external consultants that really summarizes the findings from our conversation today. And then we will, thirdly, just do a summary of 3 skills that we believe are critical for HR functions to pick up into the future if they're not doing so already. And it's really interesting. We work with quite a bit of clients in human capital development, and almost without fail, our clients are asking for the same things that we've identified. So I think it seems to be that clients are quite in touch with where we're moving and the skills that we need to develop. And then we'll close off with a slide that really kind of summarizes, I think, for me, in a very meaningful way, the kind of road that we need to tackle as far as the human capital discipline is concerned. Now, the gentleman on your screen is a person called Josh Burson. And Josh Burson is, I would argue, probably the leading expert and industry analyst as far as human resources is concerned. We work in affiliateship with Josh across the African continent. And I really loved kind of the first part of his quote. He says, the HR profession has become more important than ever. And so I think we really have seen a massive, massive elevation of the function, especially over the last 2 years, as we've entered a space and a domain that is just not known to anybody. We were in one of the African markets last week and engaging with the CEO, and the CEO said to me, I'm thinking about creating almost a smaller exco within the exco. And what do you think are the roles that should be critical in that exco? And I said, well, without any doubt, your chief HR officer plays such a fundamental role at this point in time that I don't think you can create any sub-body without having the right representation present. So Josh Berson, kind of coined this phrase of the full stack human resources professional. And I really love the model that he's put together. And out of interest, the full stack human resources professional is actually derived from the full stack IT developer. And so when Josh talks about the need to develop full stack skills, he really says for you to be effective in your role as a human capital and human resources professional, it's got to start with the HR domain expertise. So an understanding of recruitment and learning and compensation and coaching and all the kind of elements that we typically want to have a theoretical grounding in. So that really is our founding base of building skills. But that is not enough. If we want to really add value to the business, having the technical expertise is simply not enough. As a consultant, what we want to be able to do is to solve problems and listen effectively. So the kind of behavioral skills and the ability to influence thinking through problem solving and consulting is that next layer that really, really becomes important. And I think that's why we've seen, the difference between HR practitioners and HR business partners as an example. The third layer that I find quite interesting is the business acumen and industry experience. Now, I've always been a big proponent myself that the skills of a human resources professional should be portable across industries. But I do believe there is a significant value in really understanding the industry and the business in which you operate. And one of the key things here is to understand, how does our organization, how does our industry make money? So it's organizational knowledge, industry knowledge, a little bit about the history of the company, and then, of course, an understanding of finances and how the organization makes money. I've always been really, amazed as I travel the continent, where I've seen heads of HR being, engineers in the past. I've seen medical doctors, we've seen lawyers. So it really is quite a great mix of skill of people that eventually end up in some of the senior jobs. Then, of course, big developments over the last few years around technology, data, some of the tools that we use. And we'll speak a little bit later about data and the use of data within the human resources discipline. But I think it's quite critical that we really focus on becoming tech savvy and having an understanding of how data feeds decision-making. And then the last one, I think, for me is really critical, and probably in my own perspective, and you might have a different view, one of the most important ones, and it talks about the leadership and executive presence. It is really about being the conscience of the business and being able to influence the decision-making, the leadership, and the culture of the organization. So I find this to be a really useful model in talking about how do we actually develop the skills of human resources and human capital professionals as we work on a day-to-day basis. But let's just stand still for a moment and talk about what is this changing role of HR and where does it come from? And I found this really useful slide that talks about kind of the skills requirements of the future. So what are these shifts that we will see from a skills perspective? And I'm sure that many people on the call are already experiencing that. And we really divide this into two elements. The first one talks about some of the structural design changes that we need to focus on in planning for the skills that we require into the future. And so these structural design considerations, first of all, is that we require a bit of a mindset shift. And I found this myself entering my own business with some partners 2.5 years ago. I'm kind of 49 years old. I'm thinking about retirement. And all of a sudden, I started entering a massive, massive learning curve. And so I think one of the mindsets that's critical to embed and entrench in organizations is this lifelong learning culture. How do you continue to build skill? Because I don't think anybody at this point in time can afford not to continue building skills. The second one is the organizational setup. And here we're really talking about, your structure design and really having a need for more agile structures. I mean, to give an example, as we speak, we are busy with 2 projects to redesign organizational structures to be focused on how do we actually deliver service to the clients. Then a very interesting one is this new collar job. So there's this band of professional jobs that have emerged at the middle layers of the organization that creates a whole new dynamic in the organization. And as we engage with clients in job evaluation across the continent, I always remark that I'm worried that we don't have sufficient senior specialist positions coming up in the structures. And this really is what this new collar jobs refers to. Of course, the workforce composition says that a workforce is no longer made up of permanent staff. We have gig workers, we have freelancers, we have consultants, we have temp staff. And when you think about your workforce, it really encapsulates all of these, groups of people. And then, of course, C-suite and HR changes. This really talks about almost a mindset change at senior levels for kind of the CEO and some of the key functions. And it's all about orchestrating these talent strategies. How do we attract the right people? How do we retain the right people? I'm not going to spend much time on the right-hand side. That really is to say, how do we react to this need for skills? And I think as an HR professional, you will know that we can retrain where we feel there's the capability to build. We can redeploy, we can hire with critical skills, we can contract. And in some rare cases, unfortunately, sometimes we also need to release and let the right people go that might not want to be or don't have the skills to be part of that journey into the future. So let's take a short glimpse into how the world of work has really changed. And I just want to play a short video to give you a perspective on it. And then, of course, in the midst of all of the chaos that comes with all of the changes that we're facing, the world virtually came to a temporary close, and we are still feeling the effects of COVID-19 on a day-to-day basis. And I think that added a tremendous additional layer of complexity to the requirement of human resources functions to manage effectively. So let's stand still for a moment and just talk about some of the research we think is quite important to review. I will be dealing with the first one, and then I'm going to hand over to Tino to deal with some of the others. The key pieces of research we'll focus on is the Africa People Advisory New Ways of Working report, which is out of interest, we are going to be rerunning in a bit of a different version towards the next month or two. So please keep a lookout for that and feel free to participate. Then there's the 2021 Deloitte Global Human Capital Trends, the big reset report by Josh Burson that came out kind of halfway through COVID. A really interesting study, a little bit older, from 2018 by HR Future. And then I think there's some really great work in the space of Gartner around some of the top priorities for HR leaders into the future. But let me stand still for a moment and just talk about some of the emerging trends that we have found from our own study. It was really important for us as a Pan-Africa organization to create a study that focuses on the broader Africa continent. I think one of the criticisms we've had of some of our competitors is that they produce amazing study and content, but it very often does not represent the continent adequately. And having only representation in South Africa is hardly a representation of the broader continent. So we've identified 6 trends that we feel are quite important for HR functions into the future. And the first one really talks about hybrid working models, which we believe are here to stay. So we believe the future in Africa, based on feedback from our clients and participants, will be in hybrid working. And that's really where people have a combination of work from home, work from office, but definitely enabled by a new set of leadership skills. We feel that there's a shift required for leaders to lead in a very different way. The second one was really interesting for us because when we started thinking about, kind of the fourth industrial revolution and technology, we found that very few organizations had started making changes in the organizational structure in response to technology. But one of the key functions that we saw really pivot in a very big way, especially during COVID, was the learning function. And so I think a function that's really added tremendous value in a very different form. I think we can all attest to the fact that employee wellness really is center stage, and there's a very, very high risk of employee burnout that need to be managed quite actively going forward. Our kind of key topic for today is, if we want to continue adding strategic value, we really need to think about the skills that we require within the human resources function. And then number 5 is, we've seen a couple of human resources practices that have really not kept up to date on the continent, as we have seen developments elsewhere in the world. And an example of this would be employee experience. Very few organizations have really taken the rein as far as employee experience is concerned. And then lastly, diversity and inclusion. It really requires the right level of focus at board and executive levels. We are not seeing an appropriate level of traction as far as D&I is concerned. I'm going to stand still just on 1 or 2 key elements. And I think the first one really is the kind of leadership competencies. So we've identified through our survey 5 competencies that are really critical for leaders into the future. Clear communication. And I think when people don't sit with you, there is a need to make sure that you understood, that people can communicate back. Leading change has always been critical. And I think one can argue leading change might not be sufficient. It might actually be leading transformation. EQ, very, very critical to be in touch with the employee side of your business. The development of people, and then a new one, which we think is quite prevalent, is digital literacy. How do we build that digital, skills in leaders to be able to engage and lead effectively? We then ask our clients, well, how do you rate up? If you look at your leaders, how would you actually rate leaders against these set of skills? And we found, in my view, kind of a disappointing 6.7 out of 10 as far as the skills are concerned. So it shows us that there's a need to introduce some of these changes into the future, and really look at how we actually develop it effectively. We are quite keen to get your own perspectives on which you feel are the most important ones for leaders going forward. And I'm going to launch a quick skill just to get a perspective. I see we've got a few more people on the line now. We're up to about 79. The poll should be open now, so if we can ask you to quickly give us a view, which skills do you think are the most important? Do you think it's clear communication? Do you think it is leading change? Do you think it is emotional intelligence and EQ? Do you think it's the development of people? Or do you think it's digital literacy? And obviously it could be a combination of those, but just your own perspective. Which one do you think is more important than any of the others? So we're up to about 35% participation, numbers picking up quite nicely. I think I'll leave it at about 60-70% and then quickly share views. And it's a very, very even race, I have to tell you. very, very equalized. I guess the one that I expected will pick up is actually not there. So let's see shortly. We're close on 70%. We'll give it another 10 seconds and then close. Always good to see people are present by participating in polls. So I'm very glad to see that we're up to close on 80% now. Right, so let me end the poll and share some results with you. And it should be coming up on your side. So the leader, clear communication. I don't think a big surprise to me in that. EQ at 26 is a solid second. Then, of course, we've got development of people, leading change, and lastly, only 10% for digital literacy. So I guess what we're seeing is that kind of strong call to focus on the human-centered activity, which is really, really great to see. So thank you so much for that feedback. So we spoke about the need for a new set of leadership skills, but at the same time, I also want to talk a little bit about what are the kind of skills that we require as far as the human resources profession is concerned. I think it's very clear that C-suite leaders have relied extensively on the support of their HR teams and HR leaders over the last couple of years. And through that process, we've identified 5 skills in our study that are really critical for human capital professionals to think about in the future. People analytics consistently keeps on coming up as number 1. And this really is the ability to work with data and make business decisions using people data, solving business problems using people data. Problem solving is a skill itself. If you reflect back a couple of slides back, I spoke about, when you move up from your technical domain expertise into consulting, that is the space of problem solving and being able to engage the business effectively. And that leads us quite firmly into strategic consulting skills. Now, you'll say to me, Dion, why strategic consulting skills? As we start introducing technology and we start seeing kind of the merge of functions and the reduction of admin in the world of HR, it starts freeing up space to do more value-added strategic consulting work and really add the requisite level of support to the business. We've touched on business acumen and really understanding how the business makes money, how do they evolve, how do they grow? And then the one that I was a little bit surprised about, because we're not seeing a big need for this coming through on the continent, is strategic workforce planning. However, I do think there is a need to really understand what are the skills that we require into the future and how do we build that. Now, against the set of skills that we've identified, we then ask clients, well, how does your organization kind of, fare against the level of proficiency that you should have? And we were quite surprised to see a result in 2 that I specifically want to focus on. People analytics, 40% of the respondents indicated that we think we have the right level of skills and we're proficient as far as people analytics is concerned. And then the last one, strategic consulting skills, only 37% of organizations and participants said we think that we are proficient as far as strategic consulting skills are concerned. So as we see this kind of migration into IT, freeing up, capacity, there's a big need to start building these skills very, very specifically. Right, so we've spoken about a new set of skills for HR, but are there different roles that we need to pick up? If you think about that orientation in the conversation, we take leadership. What are the kind of conversations and roles that we need to fill? And there are 3 that stand out for us. The first one is to become a leadership skills champion, to really work with a business around identifying and developing the leadership skills for the future. What is the path to develop the right kind of skills to lead the workforce into the future? Really critical one for me, and I mentioned when we spoke about full stack HR professional, that leadership presence is this cultural ambassador. A key role for us is to sit back and reflect back to leadership what kind of culture we see in the organization and how that differs from what the culture should be. So we've often seen this debate around, should the HR person, report to the CEO? Should they report kind of in a matrix structure? And so we really believe cultural ambassador is quite a critical role that needs to be filled. And then the last one is employee wellness. And I think employee wellness has come through very strongly over the last year or 2 specifically, as we see very high levels of anxiety and burnout, as people are almost fighting to ensure that they retain positions into the future. Godwin, I see that you had your hand up. I'm not sure if you perhaps just want to pop a question into the chat or the Q&A, and then happy to take it from there. So I'm going to stand still here and stop share, and I'm going to hand over to Tino that will be taking you through 3 more studies, and then I will take us to the closing. Over to you, Tino.
Thanks very much, Dion. I will just pop us to here. I just specifically want to discuss the 3 studies that really stand out to us as an organization as far as learning about the future of HR and the key skills that are highlighted, particularly what people have learned throughout COVID-19 and what new skills will be carried into the future. So in 2021, Deloitte did a study on the global human capital trends, particularly the social enterprise in a world of disruption. So one of the key items that stood out in this report is really shifting from a mindset of surviving to thriving. Because of the pandemic, a lot of HR professionals and leaders alike found themselves in a surviving mindset and not a thriving mindset. And some 5 key themes came out as far as how we can start to migrate and what we need to focus on to develop a thriving mindset. And there's just a definition here that says a thrive mindset recognizes that disruption is continuous rather than episodic and embraces disruption as a catalyst to drive the organization forward. So the key things that jump out here are integrating workers' physical, mental, financial, and social health into the design of work itself rather than addressing well-being with adjacent programs. So that comes to a flexible work style, which we'll address later, capitalizing on worker agency, using technology to enhance natural human ways of working within teams, what they call super teams, which are a combination of technology and the human capital aspect. Then we have developing and acting on forward-looking insights using real-time data to harness workforce potential. And that speaks to workforce analytics that is more predictive rather than measuring the current state of the organization. Then we have the shifting role of HR, which Dion will speak to in great detail in the later slides. So the aspect of super teams, again, is moving from a place where you use technology as a tool and actually integrating the human and technological aspect into a super team and ensuring that the human aspect and the technology aspect are complementing each other. And some of the ways that we can do this is by setting audacious goals, envisioning new ways of achieving outcomes, and avoiding the instinct to use technology only. You cannot replace the human with technology, but rather you must find a way to ensure that everything is collaborating and working well together. And again, migrating from the aspect of using metrics and measurements that describe the current state and becoming more predictive, making sure that you're using real-time workforce analytics to predict what might happen as far as establishing a best guess for the future and ensuring that faster decisions are made. We've noted that having data that is available and up to date ensures a higher quality of decision making and makes sure that the organization is able to be agile in the way that it makes decisions. I think an interesting point that came out in the study is the issue of actually tracking exits in the organization and being able to assess with what they call separated workers, people who have exited the organizations are, in case you end up needing those skills in the future. I think this is not a common practice, particularly across the African continent. So that really stood out when we were studying what this research was saying. And then the last aspect that I'll touch on this is architecting and accrediting the shift to re-architecting work. So this really invites HR practitioners to start to be re-architects of work. And what that means is shifting from outputs to outcomes and proactively managing the leadership and the cultural implications in your organization. We're invited to shift from having a functional mindset that focuses on optimizing and redesigning HR processes and rather embracing an enterprise mindset that prioritizes re-architecting work to capitalize on human strengths. So really assessing the organization all across the board and saying, what are the key strengths that are popping out in my organization and where do they lie? And how can I shift things around to ensure that we get the best from everyone? A study that's near and dear to our heart is actually the Josh Bersin study. So the Josh Bersin study, he did a study called The Big Reset. And to those who might not know Josh Bersin, he's actually the father of HR at this point and is a really big thought leader. And he basically created and sort of line of thinking that talks about the reset that happened economically, socially, and in business throughout the pandemic, and highlighted 5 key themes that came out from that study. 5 key themes being new ways of working, new financial priorities and budgets, a new, more empathetic role for leadership, a renewed and deeper focus on trust, well-being, and support, and a new role for HR. So he actually highlights multiple priorities for HR and their teams that he has observed and that have come out. And I would love to see, using a sort of thumbs up, those themes that you agree that resonate with your own organization. So we have the continuous and real-time communication with employees, employee well-being in all forms coming out quite strongly. And he emphasizes the mental and physical well-being. He actually highlights a very interesting example of organizations that started ensuring that there were yoga classes happening at the workplace, cooking classes, ensuring investing in the education of children through school run, training for children, making sure that there's physical and mental coaching happening within the workplace to make sure that employee well-being is bolstered within the organization. And then supporting and developing leaders, I think that came out earlier when Dion spoke. Multifunctional HR, again, encouraging HR practitioners to actually be able to work cross-functionally, and that is with your safety facilities, IT, your legal, your finance, to be able to get quicker results and be more in touch with the business as a whole in the way that they operate and in the way decisions are made. Adapted talent practices, digital transformation at speed, again, making sure that the workforce is skilled enough to be able to utilize the technological expectations that are now present in the workplace. Agile problem solving, direct focus on family, again, touching on the holistic employee, and rather than just focusing on the work side. Maintaining productivity while adapting, remote and flexible work goes. So remote working coming out quite strongly as a theme for the future way of work. And that really speaks to performance management as well, because the two are linked, ensuring that the performance levels remain adequate and optimal while being able to provide flexibility. A lot of employees are now really considering flexibility as a key item in decision making on whether or not they join an organization. And that stands out quite firmly here. Purpose matters, again, really caring about, does this organization care about its internal customers, which is employees, and external customers? Then the rise of trust, a need to reinforce trust, and this speaks to leadership, and then coming together of employees, customers, and corporate functions. A few more that stand out to me is improved pay and benefits. I think ironically, despite some of the business hits that the organization took from a financial aspect, we find there is an expectation of increased pay and increased benefits by employees because of the pandemic and going forward. Learning all the time and continuous learning was mentioned by Dion earlier. Rules and policies with consequences, operating under uncertainty, positive psychology, psychological resistance, and new workplace protocols being developed. So a lot of themes that sort of came up there. And Dion, if there's any comments or question in the comments, please let me know. I'll move to the Gartner study that we also looked at, that also talked about the top 5 priorities for leaders in 2020. So it's quite an interesting study. And again, they emphasize a lot of the same thing, a lot of the same themes, building critical skills and competencies for the organization, and then current and future bench strength, which is quite important because it speaks again to the importance of leadership, having a strong, confident leader that can communicate well, organizational design and change management. I think Dion mentioned that we're working on quite a few organizational structures. So that's a theme that's come out where organizations are criticizing or reassessing the structures and the right size of the organizations. Then drive digital business transformation for organizations and employee experience. Employee experience coming out quite strongly there in ensuring that there is sufficient buy-in by employees and organizations. So these are some of the key challenges that came out in the Gartner study, where they talked about building critical skills and competencies for the organizations as quite a challenge, and some of the solutions being taking a market-driven predictive approach. So again, being quite close to the data, challenging employees to be more, again, being a more well-rounded employee, getting the right skills that you need to, connecting employees to skills building opportunities. And that speaks to training and development and being intentional about that. Current and future bench strength, again, this is equipping leaders, making sure they're adequately trained to make the sort of leadership decisions to drive the business forward. Organizational design and change management, involving employees to co-create and change strategy, shift ownership. So taking a more involved approach and making sure that employees are at the center of change, whatever that change looks like for the organization. Driving digital business transformation for the organization, becoming a digital business, being a talent architect, and making sure human resources is more agile. And lastly, employee experience, where really some of the key solutions are calibrating employees' expectations for the employee experience. So making sure you have data from the employees themselves, whether through an employee engagement exercise, empowering employees to tailor their day-to-day experiences. So again, flexible working, ensuring that employees have some autonomy in the way they work, and then managing the memory of the employee. And those are the key 5 things that really came out from the Gartner study. I will hand over to Dion to talk about the HR Future study and some of the key learnings we had from that study. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tino. Just quickly sharing my desktop. If we can just confirm that it is visible.
Yes, quite visible.
Okay, and it is just also checking that it's on full screen view and not by presentation view. Perfect, thank you so much. So the last study that I will cover very briefly is a study that I came across quite a few years, but I really thought it was prudent to touch on this again because it really summarized, even at that point in time, what we kind of view to be some of the key things we want to focus on. So what makes this study a little bit different is it was actually a crowdsourced study on survey conducted on LinkedIn in November 2018, and it targeted HR and other professionals. And the target audience was more than 100,000 people in 60 countries. So kind of, data directly from the source. And the typical company size that was targeted was above 1,000 employees, which is, often kind of larger than some of the companies that we work with on typical projects. So I think a well-represented survey. And if we consider the top in-demand skills coming out at that point in time, which I think is still hugely relevant today, the first one is people analytics. The second one is about how do we manage and influence stakeholders and others to make sure that we can kind of, embrace this digital workplace. So there's a strategic consulting piece and an influencing piece that sits in this for me. And then, of course, the last one is all about technology and, using HR techniques and technologies to make sure that we can manage the functions effectively into the future and add value. Just in between, I'll quickly just answer a question that's come through on the chat as well. We will make sure that the slides are available afterwards, and there will also be a recording of the webinar that will be posted and sent to you on our YouTube channel. So rest assured that the content is available afterwards. So if we look at those as the top 3 kind of skills coming out, or 1 or 2 others that I want to highlight, I think we've spoken about the first 3: strategic workforce planning, and that really aligns with our own study. So there's definitely something in around, organizational restructure, looking at critical skills and what's the kind of jobs that we need. Design thinking, and then you can kind of see it crop up every now and then. And then stakeholder management, really, really critical, some of the key skills as well. And then there's a kind of consolidation of other ones that sit right at the end. So that really closes our review of research that I think is important to consider in getting to a list of what we think would be the key skills to develop into the future. So what is it that we end up with and why does it matter? So I think for me, what's more important is to talk about why is this so important? And for me and for us, it's really all about the block on the right-hand side, which is employee experience. And a lot of HR functions still almost confuse employee engagement with employee experience. So employee engagement typically is some kind of dip check measure. It could be a full survey, but it really is driven by some kind of survey instrument. Where the world is moving, though, and where human capital functions are moving is into the space of employee experience. And I'll encourage you to maybe also on our LinkedIn page, I posted a quick survey, a quick poll this morning. So if you want to go to Africa People Advisory Group on LinkedIn, join the page and participate in the survey, because we're quite keen to see whether that has moved. And what we found in our survey is that only 27% of HR functions have formally adopted the principles of EX, and only 29% of HR functions have made somebody accountable for EX. For me, EX is the new kind of door opening in the field of human capital, and really requires a multidisciplinary approach to dealing with the need for an employee experience. And we will be running a future webinar to specifically focus on EX. But this is the why. These skills really, for me, feed into the need to drive a consistent and effective employee experience. So we've got 3 skills identified. No surprise that HR metrics and analytics sits on top. Strategic consulting skills, we've touched quite a bit. And then lastly is the need to build a set of digital skills. So let's spend a little bit of time on each of these. When we start with the first one, metrics and analytics, and you look at a typical value chain of a human resources function, kind of at the bottom end, employee record keeping, administration and so forth, and we move right to the top. Right below HR strategy is workforce planning and analytics. So that really shows us that it's a field of high complexity, but very, very high value add. And that's really why we see it coming up on a regular basis. On the left-hand side is a pretty well-known continuum of HR metrics and analytics, or workforce metrics and analytics, that has become quite well known in the discipline of metrics and analytics. And it really starts on the bottom left, saying that many organizations would focus on things like anecdotes or reactive checks. And that in an exco meeting, a senior manager might say, I think we're losing lots of sales staff, but HR actually doesn't know. So we go and do a check. Where most companies operate is in ongoing reports. They do a monthly report. To be very honest, sometimes we actually forget why we do it. And if you stop doing it, many line managers won't even ask for it. And then we start questioning, is it really the right kind of, report that we produce? Where companies are moving to is the space of segmentation, where you slice and dice the information and compare. And then, of course, also correlations and causation. But where we want to end is really to be able to say, can we forecast what will happen into the future? So can we do predictive analytics? And of course, what we know is the key thing is on the left-hand side is I think, and we want to move to where we end up with I know. On the right-hand side, in our survey, in the new ways of working study, we ask companies, where do you spend most of your time? And we'll show you kind of an overlap of the two in the next moment. Right, so I'm going to skip past this one just in the interest of time. So what do we see? When we overlay where we should be focused, we see that where companies are focusing is diametrically opposed to where the focus should be. So a lot of companies are focusing on ongoing reports. A lot of companies, 70% are focused on reactive checks. And so what we need to do is we need to flip this around to start moving more towards the predictive side and predictive analytics. Then if we move away briefly from HR metrics and analytics, the second one I want to talk about is your strategic consulting skills. And when you look at the first slide, I really love that first sentence. It says, when problem solving, listening, understanding, and decision-making intersect, that is where strategic consulting skills are formed. And Josh Bersin and the Josh Bersin Academy really summarizes the need of almost wearing 5 hats in becoming a well-rounded HR business partner. And the first one he talks about is about being the strategic advisor. So how do I help the business solve business problems in the right way from a people perspective? How do I provide that strategic insight of where we need to move on the people side? The second item supporting that is, of course, the data-driven problem solver. So how do I work effectively with data and analytics in getting to a point where we can solve business problems using people data? One of the items that we're starting to kind of, investigate and do a little bit more work in is in storytelling, because, having a set of data doesn't really convey the right kind of message. So one of the skills we want to build for an HR business partner is to be able to tell effective stories using data specifically. Then, of course, the trusted coach. And I think we often forget, as we work with senior leaders in the organization, you always think that they're bulletproof, but they are also in need of coaching. They're also in need of support. they also need of somebody to actually listen to them, to be a reflective force almost. And then the independent voice, as I said, when I kind of started growing up in my HR career, one of the first things I was taught is that we are the conscience of the business. We are there to represent the people side of the business and hold the mirror up and say, these are the things that we think is important to focus on, and where perhaps the organization is faltering from a people perspective. Okay, apologies. Let me just quickly fix that one. Right, just making sure that you can still see my screen clearly.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Right, so I'm going to once again just skip past this poll and talk about what are some of the shifts that we want to see within the human resources discipline. And I really love the slide because I think it's a great consolidated version of the shifts required within our field. And the first one talks about creating capacity. Now, we've spoken about the fact that a lot of our time that we spend is actually spent on kind of systems and record keeping and admin. And where we want to move to is really to that digital workplace. So we want to be able to, create an environment where we work in a digital space, and we're able to focus on the consulting part of the business. The second item, and Friedrich, I see that you've got your hand up. I'll get you shortly. I don't know if you perhaps want to pop your comment or question into the chat box, and happy to deal with it from there. The second one is to grow capability, and the grow capability is really saying, we've been focusing on kind of this back office function. We've been focusing on working in the business. Ourselves being business owners, we kind of well aware of the fact that at some point in time, you can't just work in the business. You actually have to move to be working on the business. Thanks, Friedrich. So really critical for us to start thinking holistically and strategically about how we support the organization, as opposed to being that almost back office function. Then empower community. This is something that I feel particularly passionate about. And I think about the days that I was in corporate for many, many moons, and I was very focused on the segment that I worked in, and I was quite internally focused. And I often say to clients that I engage with, you don't necessarily have to work with us, but there is so much information outside of your organization that can inform decision-making in the people space inside of your organization. And one of my key regrets in a corporate job is that I didn't spend time building the external networks. And I think that's really, really great. And I often see this with learning functions, doing it so effectively. And then lastly, of course, is to boost credibility. So we want to move away from functional orientation to really solving business problems. So we want to achieve the right kind of business outcomes in the way that we work on the people side. The very last one I'm going to focus on then is digital skills, very briefly and very quickly. So I kind of really like this first sentence. It says the role of the digital HR lead will underpin the HR function of the future. So when we start having the right focus as far as digitalization of the HR function, if you think about how do we obtain information from the voice of the employee through all kinds of tools and digital means, it really starts underpinning this full process of employee experience. And so when we look at, once again, some of the transformation happening in the digital space, and one or two items that I want to highlight from this particular study, around 86% of HR professionals currently spend their time in administrative work. And we see this often as we engage with clients, how much time we actually waste on admin non-value added work. And a good example of that I often see is that HR kind of collects every single signed performance contract in the organization because there isn't sufficient trust in the system to know that the process was done correctly, just as an example. There is a view and a perspective that in 10 years from now, the shared services that supports HR could be fully automated. And so where we're seeing the focus move is into the space of skills development. So on the one side, we know that we require from a CEO and an exco perspective a set of skills for the future. And on the other side, one of the big asks that we see also out of our engagement survey work is a need for employees to have the right level of development. So there's almost this convergence of a discussion around skills and around, both from the organization, but also from an employee perspective. So my HR Future, I mentioned the study a little bit early on. They've identified kind of 3 blocks of focus for HR in building kind of to succeed in the digital age. And they talk about data-driven, experience-led, and business-focused. And we can see digital literacy focus very strongly in experience-led. And this is all about how do we actually create the right employee experience with the right level of digital literacy. So I'm going to close with one final slide, and then we can open up for any questions or comments. And the final slide for me kind of really hit me quite hard when I saw it the first time, because I thought a lot about the years that I spent in corporate HR managing large HR functions. And I always say to people that I engage with, if I have one regret from one of the organizations that I worked with in a large team, is that I feel I probably introduced way too much governance and allowed for little flexibility. And I think it would be amiss to not share that particular lesson and life lesson with you from our own career. So the key shifts that we want to see is really moving from human resources to people and culture professionals. And I see a kind of a very close client of ours, Koresha, and in their organization, the terminology is not HR, it's about people and culture. And that really is where the focus should be. The second big one is policy enforcer. As I mentioned, I was very focused on driving all of the governance stuff. And I don't want to say that governance is not important, but we should not be kind of limiting creativity and the ability to operate effectively by almost killing the business with red tape and overly governing processes. And where we want to focus is to move more towards this employee experience ambassador. So how do we really become that champion and enable employees to operate effectively? I think in the past used to be really, really process driven, and that, once again goes to policy enforcer. And as we start enabling our processes with the use of technology, we really should be a lot more people driven. I think because we sit in a discipline where we kind of manage salaries, we manage employee records, we tend to be a function that often shares very little. And I think where we need to move to is to be sharing a lot. I'm not proposing that we share payroll and so forth, but think about what information really is that critical that we can't actually share and be open about it. And then lastly, second lastly, saying no to saying yes. I'm often amazed at the power that HR leaders have in just simply saying no without reason. And I think we've got to get to a culture where we say yes a lot more and find reasons to say yes. And then we often try and force fun versus having a culture where fun happens naturally. So I'm gonna stand still there and allow for any questions or comments that might be coming through. We've got Oliver on the line as well. He's kind of managing the process at the back end. So please feel free to provide any questions or open in the chat box if you want to. So I see there's a comment there on the Q&A. Please could you share an ideal HR framework or model to incorporate new ways of working, targeted specifically at employee experience, and we drive a line manager model where all managers share the business strategy. I guess it's a more complex answer than a simple verbal answer here. But I would say for our anonymous attendee to really investigate the principles of employee experience, because I think if you can get employee experience right and you really invest in focusing on employee experience, the model that supports it in all likelihood will emerge over time. And so, we kind of asking questions whether the old center of excellence model is still relevant. I think the answer is focus on designing your HR processes and principles around the employee more than anything else. So that's probably the way that I would respond to that one. So any other questions or comments from anybody? We'll encourage you, as I mentioned before, the recording will be available. We'll send it by email on our YouTube channel. Encourage you to please go and participate in our poll that's currently running on our LinkedIn page, just at Africa People Advisory Group. And then very lastly, we will have a dedicated webinar going forward on employee experience that will be happening on the 6th of April. So you will receive an invite shortly for the EX webinar that really talks about what is EX, what are some of the models underpinning EX, and how do you start kind of introducing EX into your own organization. So thank you very much for attending. I know that we're quite tight on time. We've got about 2 minutes left. Thank you very much for attendance, and we will hang on the line in case there's any further questions or comments. Thanks so much. There's a really interesting question here. One simple question: do you think the shift will happen equally through all African countries? It's a little bit of a tricky question. I mean, my simple answer would probably be no, because I think a lot of the progress in some of these disciplines is also driven by almost country culture, company culture. What's the prevalent industry really running kind of the HR industry? So I would think that we would probably sit at different paces, as we see with many other things. So I would think that we will probably find differences from country to country in a simple answer. I see a question from Israel around how best can the change be implemented. And I think the simple thing is we've got to build a business case. And the way that we will build a business case is by using data. And so, Israel, I would say what you need to start thinking about is what is the kind of data that you would need to collect on the people side to show the value of the role that we play. So if we, as an example, want to start thinking about, moving into employee experience, what I would start to do is to simply go and collect data around what we refer to as the moments that matter. So a moment that matter is kind of those key points in the life of an employee where their perception of the organization is formed, whether it be positive or negative. And for me, it often just starts with collecting the right level of data. I note a comment there on, could we share some real life case studies? We will be talking about 1 or 2 international case studies on EX in the next one. Sadly, we haven't seen necessarily significant progress on the continent as far as EX is concerned, but we do have 1 or 2 case studies that we will share in the EX webinar around what has happened globally. I see there's a question there around Agile. Thank you for the insightful session. How can HR evolve to support organizations that are adopting full-scale Agile? It's probably not advisable for me to try and answer that one because we don't necessarily specialize in Agile, although, I think it's probably quite similar to many of the kind of business process improvement and culture initiatives we've seen over the last couple of years. But yeah, I'm happy to connect you if you want to reach out to me individually. There are some people that we work with that most specifically operate in the space of Agile. So MKM, you are most welcome to reach out to me directly. It's just dion@africapeopleadvisorygroup.com, and happy to connect you to people that operate specifically in the space of Agile. Right. So I know that we're on the dot 11 o'clock. So we are close the conversation here. Thank you very, very much for your time and your attendance. And as I noted, we will post the recording on our YouTube channel afterwards. If there are any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to set up an engagement and chat through it. Thank you very much and have a good day further.